We're here in a nice breeze at Montserrat Vineyards, and I'm speaking with the Poet Laureate for the state of Missouri, David Clewell. David, can you tell me professionally what's your occupation right now?
I teach in the English department at Webster University in St. Louis and direct the creative writing program there.
I understand you have another title as well besides Poet Laureate that I read about in the St. Louis Magazine. And what would that title be? And give me a little background there.
When I was first asked about this from the governor's office, wanted to follow through, and I'd been nominated, and I wasn't being coy, but I did tell them, let me think about it a couple days. It's very flattering. And at the supper table, my son Ben said, listen, you should go ahead and follow through with it, because if you do, you know you're going to get it, and then I can write that poetry overlord character into my graphic novel. So, Poetry Overlord, that's the title.
Maybe we'll call this interview the Poetry Overlord for the state of Missouri. Poetry today, and looking back over the past, is it serving the same function in our societies and communities and interpersonally?
I think it is, and at least it fully can too. And one of the things about states poet laureates, not all of the states have them, but there are a majority that do now, is to sort of maybe reawaken in people, I mean the citizens, not college English majors or other folks, but people I would call less automatically poetry inclined, that it does have something to do with all of our lives. And in that sense, I think it's not any different. I think what might be different is just the way that we are exposed to it.
Seeing you've dedicated your life to poetry in the last several years, one might assume that you've loved poetry from a very young age.
Well, there we go. The way it's taught. When I was in grade school and junior high and most of high school, I really hated poetry. It would send me running top speed in the opposite direction. I was a kid growing up in New Jersey, and I was looking around, and I didn't see any little flowers cracking up through the ground, not immediately where I was. No winged horses, winged horses, right? No, it didn't. So my coming to it was not late by human life standards, but yeah, there were, shall we say, unappreciated facets of the art.
Now, you talked about how poetry, you really started to appreciate it once it really related to life, but yet a number of your subjects might be seen as pretty fantastic or sensational or infamous. Jack Ruby, I know you've done quite a bit of writing that features him, UFOs or spontaneous human combustion, and so how do you reconcile those two positions?
Well, again, it's one of those propositions. If I had a buck for every time, Clewell writes about weird things. Spontaneous human combustion, the flying saucers, whatever all it is. I think that I don't consciously think about it when I start working on a piece, but so often what begins to tumble out in notes or notebooks would sort of gravitate toward this idea of what does it take for certain people to believe and believe in that helps them along and make it one day to the next, whether it's physical survival in some cases, but certainly emotional and psychic survival. So I'm not trying to write encyclopedia entries on strange phenomenon. I don't want a cable channel show with the ghost hunters, the monster questers, and everybody else glommed into one. But in some of those extreme situations, I think what fascinates me most is less an encyclopedia entry and what are we really talking about human being-wise here. Jack Ruby was a toss-off, and he'd gotten left out of a poem, and then I couldn't shake Ruby. Well, yes, I'm interested in that whole scene in Dallas and what did or didn't happen that weekend. But aside from that, I'm asking myself, what's my interest then in this character who's essentially, no getting around it, thuggish, low-life, kind of cheesy, and finally, I guess, writing through it is finding the answer to why am I so interested in the first place.
This poem isn't an intricate theory, years in the making. This poem can speak only for this poem. This poem will tell you it's not what you think. This poem's nothing more than a series of coincidences. This poem can't help but attract the occasional crackpot. This poem is offered in full compliance with the Freedom of Information Act. This poem's not anything like the official version. This poem's holding back. This poem's covering up. This poem may be afraid of worldwide panic. This poem's no secret prototype the government is testing. This poem has powerful friends behind it. This poem is something you'd be happier not knowing. This poem is murder on reliable eyewitnesses. This poem's counting on your complete cooperation. This poem can put you at the scene of untold crimes, or this poem's your ironclad alibi, depending. This poem doesn't want anything to happen to you. This poem hopes you get the message, although this poem has no explicit message of its own. This poem can't promise it will bail you out. This poem won't even remember you. This poem is well aware of the statute of limitations. This poem means what it says. This poem means anything you need it to. This poem's seen things hard to believe. This poem's all you have to believe. This poem has implications. This poem couldn't possibly be. This poem is so good it ought to be illegal. This poem is the only hard evidence recovered. This poem has your prints all over it. This poem's recently been discharged. This poem is not a disgruntled loner acting spontaneously. This poem has been seen consorting with other known poems. This poem has Confederates in top floor windows all over the city. This poem never goes by the same name twice. This poem has no highly trained Russian look-alike. This poem never receives specific instructions. This poem has nothing better to do. This poem can hit you where you live. This poem seldom misses at that distance. This poem has its story down cold. This poem doesn't want to have to say it more than once. This poem's never seen its share of the money. This poem is just the patsy. This poem laughs at witness protection. This poem wants immunity before it starts naming names. This poem's not taking the fall for anyone. This poem has you exactly where it wants you. This poem you think you're getting to the bottom of right now. This poem that's taken you into its confidence. This poem that's made you an accomplice after whatever the fact. This poem suggesting in so many words that it's always been on your side. This poem doesn't make those kinds of mistakes. This poem gives you up every time.
I understand from reading a little about you that actually music and jazz predated your interest in poetry. Do you think there's a connection?
Somewhere, somebody with more certifiable degrees or somebody who's just more certifiable and say, oh, undoubtedly. But yeah, it did. Music, as I said, was always important to me, not in any egg-headed way, but as a kid. In fourth grade, they laid out band instruments because the option was to take a band instrument in summer band school. And I remember walking past all of these things, and it was the trumpet. I said, how hard could that be? 3 notes. Give me the trumpet. And so then when I went along for that ride and saw the first lesson or the first sit down with the person instructing it, depressing none of the valves, 20,000 notes are possible. I said, okay, well, that's a typical Clewell move, stumbling in. But as a listener, yeah, I heard Coleman Hawkins. I heard me talk about that a little bit yesterday. Tumbling out of a third floor walk up in New Brunswick, New Jersey was some of the most amazing music I'd ever heard. And that's what put me on the road to just as a listener to jazz. Absolutely so. In my mind, yeah, they absolutely have to be related. But it's not, for instance, as if I will put on, some Miles or Clifford Brown or Sonny Rollins or whoever it is while I'm writing. But yeah, that in terms of the stopping and the starting and the rhythmic things is important to me in a poem too.
When you're approaching a work, you're very observational. It looks like virtually every poem starts from seeing something or experiencing something, and then you develop that in so many interesting ways. What is your process? Do those thoughts come to you relatively fully formed? Do you know where you're heading, or how do you?
And it's a good question, because when I'm teaching, I'm trying to tell my own students, if you know where you're heading too early, you will inevitably head there. And that's, I don't mean as a compliment, nor would I mean it as a compliment to myself. American poet Richard Hugo, whose work and life always meant a lot to me, said, never want to say something so badly that you give up the chance of finding something better. And he said it in this bear-like voice. So no, when I start, it's either, yeah, something seen, you know, that over-observed or overheard, audio-wise, is a lot of my cue too. And my process is, not on a computer, by the way, but on legal pads, typewriters, anything that is dinosaur enough that makes me feel comfortable, is to jot down some of those things and just listen to the language or look at the image and see, hey, where might that go? So no, I really don't have much of an idea at all at the beginning. Now, obviously, somewhere along the way, we want to kick in with some notion of cohesiveness, but it's important to me that you know, I have 100 beginnings now that I don't know if any of them will pan out, but I'm happy because I still don't know where most of them think they're headed.
So your writing is also a process of personal discovery.
Oh, absolutely. And it's sort of like in talking about Ruby, but with anything, with learning that the lawn flamingos, the original lawn flamingos by a guy named Don Featherstone in the late 50s, were finally being pulled and not going to be made by that factory anymore. So yeah, we're not talking about profound significance. Why do I care? What? It's interesting, but yes, yeah, he likes that American kitsch and culture. But yes, the process for me is, if the poem stays drafting itself ahead, it's really sort of answering why do I care, or why was I so struck by that in the first place? And sometimes the answer is stentorian, not from me, but from the cosmos somewhere. But more often, it's really pretty down to earth, and so often I think it comes by to what people end up caring about, and without trying to lean on the word too much, believing in.
Of course, poetry is a two-part process. There's the writing process, but also the reading and enjoying and understanding process. Do you find yourself gravitating toward writers that are like you when you are looking to read poetry, or writers that are different?
I mean, there's some overlap. Most of the people I read and really am fond of and attracted to are not particularly writing in my style or approaches or even subject matter. But I think one of the things that, as a reader, always strikes me truly is in the hands of a poet who's showing me something in a way that I've never thought about it before. But now that she's asking me to consider it this way, by, say, the example of her poem, I have that feeling as a reader that says, wow, that seems so right. So you've got the unexpected, that's what keeps it fresh, and then what I like to call the inevitable, that feeling of, how could I not have known that all along? But I didn't. So that, yeah, just by sheer odds, most of the reading, most of the writers I like, it's not that they are stylistically, or that I am stylistically like them, but that's the bedrock. I am going to show you as specifically as possible through that concrete image, and it doesn't have to be somebody bursting into flames, a way into thinking about some other stuff.
Even though I'm only staying the night, I have a sinking feeling there's going to be trouble. The real guests are talking it up in the living room as if this is truly the life. What more could people want so far from home than to have every bit of their weariness and hunger taken so personally? Why would anyone settle for less? When they checked in and filled out that card with way too much space for tell us all about yourself, I bet they were more than happy to oblige. I can hear them even now, while I'm writing down the only thing I'm sure of after my name and my actual address. I can already tell there's no way I deserve this kind of attention. I travel for the thrill of asserting what I can't be expected to know, because I enjoy the molecular rearrangement that being a stranger occasions. I don't necessarily want to feel as if I'm somehow fitting into the familiar chambers of my life one more time. It's as if my Aunt Ida suddenly was named the nation's hotelier. And from now on, no such thing as too much potpourri, too many of those giant ceramic pitchers on hallway tables, dried flowers sprouting from the mouths of all the usual antiques in the land. Aunt Ida in St. Louis, Salt Lake City, Sausalito, New Orleans, Aunt Ida, beckoning from every porch swing throughout charm-smitten New England. It's not enough that this place takes its name from some official roster of the atmospherically correct. Each room has its own ambiance spelled out. The salt air, the espresso, the Battle of Gettysburg room. And there's no major hoople from my Sunday funnies childhood showing me the way, guiding star of our boarding house, resplendent in his fez, calf-calfing through adventure after unlikely adventure. No, my hosts are gentle Dick and Jane, grown serious and pale after too many years of rehabbing their straight and narrow world. 10 minutes of this, and my own color's fading. I'm already losing sleep I haven't even thought of yet. I'm actually on my knees in front of the bookcase, a shelf or two of books they insist on calling the library. Soil conservation, 2 local histories, the requisite wisdom of Edgar Guest. I grabbed the Boy Scouts survival handbook because now the other guests are chummied up around the piano, lost in a spirited medley of show tunes, and I'm afraid it only gets worse. Some trigger-happy souls bound to pull out a guitar, squeeze off a few rounds of Michael row the boat ashore. And then it's kumbaya before you know it. So I'm turning my polite version of a pillow over and over, looking for the cool side. I'm really expected to sleep through this night, to wake up for breakfast. Fresh squeezed juice and something like scones, a china cup of exotic decaffeinated coffee, while all these slap-happy pilgrims talk about what's next. The Eichhorns will be, as always, irrepressible. They're excited about meandering through another farmer's market. Nancy and Donna can't wait to be in a boat on the lake. And Dick and Jane might smile and wonder out loud what could possibly be in store for Mr. Misanthrope, as if I didn't have enough to answer for already. I can dream, though, can't I? There's a sleepy 1950s aqua-trimmed motel. Its vacancy still radiant in neon. The guy at the night desk doesn't want to talk about politics or love, much less about his hula girl tattoo. He doesn't give a damn if I'm in town, on legitimate business, on the lam, on account of any sunburned Donna. And the unassuming key he hands over lets me into the cradle of civilization as I've come to know it room, where I kick off my shoes with impunity and warm up the TV, caressing its lovely rabbit ears. It's my kind of night already. Later, I'm walking the grounds with that plastic bucket in my hands, drawn to the all-night humming of the ice machine, its cold beauty the surest sustenance around. In moments, I'll have something to carry with me for as long as it lasts, something finally to give away when people come asking. And I can get more if I have to. I can give them all they want. Because sometimes it's hard to remember exactly who you are, what you're doing anywhere. That's when I least believe in talking it out or sleeping it off or passing it around a table like bread till everyone's had his fill. And even if we are supposed to feel like part of the same ridiculous family, no matter how big, how impossibly happy, I can't imagine for the life of me why people would choose to make themselves so much at home that they're perfectly willing to sing along through endless verses full of those same assurances that no one's a stranger to suffering, but neither will we be strangers forever to the blessings that seem a little far away right now. Okay, so maybe just one more time. River Jordan is chilly and wide. Bed and breakfast on the other side.
You know, over the last several years in reading poetry, I find some poets that really try to make each line a jewel and each line an epic piece in itself. And I'm not trying to be condescending by any means. You know, I don't see your work in that way. But at the same time, I find lines like this. we're done in by the weightlessness and then the unexpected gravity of love. Or something like, what's left, I'm sorry to say, is that dark that everyone's afraid of, referring, I think, to death in your poetry. And so I do see those lines. And as a writer, what do you seek to do in that regard?
The line is the single most important thing to me, and the single biggest joy to me, too. As you know well by now, and people found out yesterday, Clewell don't write the haiku. So we're not talking about 17 syllables worth. You know, that may be sometimes half of an opening line. But it's still thinking about where does that line stop and start. And really for a couple of different reasons. Rhythmic purposes, I mean, even in free verse, I want to catch some certain rhythms. But it also affects content. I think that first example that you gave, and now I feel self-conscious talking about a line or two of my own, but that being done in, I believe that the gravity ends that line, and then of love picks up the thought. And if I'm wrong about that, there are plenty of instances where that'll happen. I'm not trying to trick the reader, but sometimes in the turn of that line, it's also playing with the content and trying to nuance out, if you will, a couple of additional things about it at those small moments. So even though some of my poems look like bricks on a page, as one editor so thoughtfully put it to me, they're long lines and they're not short stanzas. Yeah, every line is consciously thought out, but you're right. It's not that notion of, whew, here's a line of poetry, here's a line of poetry. I'm trying to make that as under the radar as possible. And when you do a lot of work with a narrative element, the way that I do too, you couldn't possibly, even if you wanted to, say every line's going to be a gem. Because on the one hand, you're telling a story, but you're still freeze-framing it and isolating moments. But the line, absolutely the coolest thing for me about poetry. As a reader, to see how that affects the music and the content, and certainly as a writer. It's the thing that keeps me in it.
You do encounter a number of students very young in their writing careers or in their appreciation of poetry careers. In addressing those people, well, first of all, I should ask, are they all appreciative of poetry by the time they get to your courses?
Not necessarily at all. I mean, it's probably 50-50. I teach an intro workshop, so a studio class, and fit about 50-50 there. Some people just want to see what it's all about. But in all of my classes, even in the writing classes, we do an awful lot of reading, because other poems is any poet's best teacher, not the person alive in the classroom. So one of the first things that I'm interested in is helping them appreciate how to read different kinds of poems. I mean, literally to read it, not out loud, but to process it, to think about lines the way we were talking about it, to think about the image, to think about content. And if somebody finishes an introductory course like that, for instance, and decides, well, you know, this is not for me, or gee, it was more than just writing down my thoughts and feelings, or whatever the particular tack might be, if they can now read a poem more fully, more confidently, then I think that's been a good use of their time, and certainly of mine too. Poet Billy Collins said, you know, one of the first things that you want to do, or that a poem asks you to do, is to slow down. So in a long-winded answer to your question, if I've taught some of these people, even say the greenest of the green, in approaching a poem, slow down, turn off all your electronic devices, figuratively, literally, anything else, slow it down. I really think that is a good use of time. And then with other courses that I teach, it's going to have a more natural progression of people who have identified themselves as, I really want to dig into this. And I'm just as happy, I'm very happy to be able to teach literature classes too. And literature, small L, not literature, literature classes. Because again, that's where you're going to learn about this stuff. I mean, even if your main aim is to say, how do I write this better? So a good concentrated dose of the reading and talking about it. And I think the ability to read something as a writer, which is not an original phrase with me, is different than somebody just as a student or a critic or a generalized reader. Because when you're writing, or when you want to write, when you are a writer, you can't help but wonder with one track of your brain, how did he get from A to B? So I teach at my best, on my best days anyway, how to make that as real a part of the process of reading as possible.
say, one small step for man? I told him it had to be for a man, or else that mankind bit seems absolutely senseless. Any notion of symmetry and scale, shot to hell. To say nothing of humility, the stepping, the leaping, the one guy, the many. Like every gung-ho flyboy, he's at his best in the air. He's not used to saying much that doesn't come up banged out on the ground. He made it to the goddamn moon, and with 600 million people watching on TV, he flubs the one line he couldn't stop rehearsing all the way out here. These 6 hours since we landed, going nowhere, gave him far too much time to dwell on his brief moment in the reflected sun. He should have made up something entirely new on the spot, where he could actually feel the gravity of the situation, just 1/6 of any he'd ever known before. Something lighter, maybe, when he could finally see that first impressions here wouldn't carry too much weight. I realize the name Armstrong has a ring that Buzz can't muster, a certain all-American sonority that made him the obvious choice to step down first into this staggering historical occasion. Yeah, he got us to tranquility by hand, overriding the onboard computer when we were running scared and low on fuel, skirting an impossibly rocky crash landing. But still, I really should have put my foot down before something like this happened. History has a way of forgetting the kind of man who's second on the scene. But this isn't exactly the toughest act to follow. I can still be the first man on the moon to walk and make grammatical sense at the same time. Let Armstrong make the obligatory long-distance small talk with Nixon, who's not about to miss out on his gratuitous piece of this action. He'll come on the line with his self-important locker room voice insisting we kick some Russian butt out here tonight, unless at the giddy height of his power and at least a few sheets to his favorite wind, he ends up saying some Russian's butt instead, which would make it a more limited triumph, but luckily nothing less than truly the aim of this operation all along. And finally, owning up to that much, no matter who or how imperfectly, would have to go down as one small step in the right direction. But remember, even after I've struck what's left of this lunar pay dirt myself, you didn't hear that, or even anything close to that from me.
In popular culture, lists are really seem to be the thing nowadays, and I generally despise them myself, but I'm asking you to come up with one. Are there some canons in poetry that people just should not miss, people that need to be exposed to start to really get the full appreciation of the art form?
Boom! Walt Whitman. I mean, let me start just at American poetry. It sounds an expected answer, and maybe it is, but we are a country still young enough compared to some other countries to have an identifiable mother and father of its poetry. And absolutely without argument, the father is Whitman and the mother is Dickinson. Now, this is a fairly strange mom and pop operation when you consider the two of them together. But there's writing in America before these two. There's poetry. But I would argue that an American poetry, not something just sort of borrowed and absconded and varied from the British English, really does start with those two. So even if I have students or my next door neighbor, it doesn't matter, it's not just a college setting, groaning a bit, they absolutely have to be reckoned with, because after them, just sticking even with American poetry, it's like a family genealogy in a Bible. You can follow it all off, and it shakes different shapes and it tentacles out in different directions. But ultimately, if we went backwards, it will all come back up to those two. So that exists. But, you know, beyond that and beyond that parochial, it's tough. So I have more, you know, expected answers. It's hard to not come to Shakespeare. You know, Lord Buckley said, you give Willie the shake, right? A nickel's worth of ink and a scroll of paper, and he'll write you up a storm. Right? it's hard to not reckon with some of those people. But coming up even to our present time, and certainly internationally, it's so hard. 20th century, I think Pablo Neruda is probably one of the poets of literally the world in the 20th century. But yeah, the lists are hard.
Somebody that's not really committed themselves much to poetry yet, but they realize that there are thousands of people that have been writing for hundreds of years, they might think, there's nothing new that can be said. How do you address that as an instructor of poetry?
Well, it really is humbling, and you humble yourself in the art every day. When I'm working on a new piece of, however early in the draft, there's always a part of my brain and my heart that says, well, who am I to put a David Clewell thing on this fierce laboring pile of all of these writers' poems, some that we've just mentioned, that have come before? What kind of ego must that be? So I think that whether I'm working in a classroom or just trying to remind myself, I think the notion of ego is important, in the richest sense of ego, not egomania. But it takes a certain sort of constitution to say, well, as you suggest, maybe it hasn't been shown quite this way before. I mean, Ezra Pound said, there are no new subjects under the sun. You pretty much got friendship, death, sex, love, power. No new human emotions have been invented either. But the constant reawakening of who we are to ourselves and each other has always been defined in terms of the society and the culture that the writer's writing out of. So we've got more things to reckon with, though in specifics. Though, again, back at the bedrock, there we are. We're going to come back to what makes us human on the planet. But it's a daunting prospect. And without trying to scare anybody out of the water early on, I talk at least a kinder, gentler version of that from the get-go. It's got to have that sense of, because that's ideally what you want. Not everything has been said. And it's a good distinction. I like the way you put that. Not everything has been said. Now, if we went more generally, every emotion's been covered. But not everything's been said. Somewhere in the vortex or the interstices of that, okay, that's where the next poem may lie.
When I pick up, the voice on the other end of the phone is already off and running. You were right, man. You were so incredibly right. And now I'm more than sorry I didn't believe you when you claimed the only way to keep their voices out of our heads was by using heavy-duty aluminum foil, the kind our own mothers went crazy for when it came to preparing leftovers for their deep freeze oblivion. You tried to tell me regular foil's too thin for making any kind of proper headgear. A ponderous buffer zone helmet, or something less obtrusive and more stylish, say a wave-deflecting beret. Listen, next time I visit, I'll bring enough of the extra strength for us both. And although this sounds like something I certainly might have suggested, perhaps only to my closest friends, it's true, it happens that I didn't. And finally, he stops to worry up a whisper, "This isn't my friend Stewart, is it?" And I say, "No," and he says, "Oh my God, man, they've gone and gotten through to you, haven't they?" As if he's the one who can't believe what he's hearing, who's never felt so disconnected, standing in the middle of whatever room he's renting in his suddenly less than accommodating life. There's no way he can appreciate how accidentally he's reached me, how sympathetic I really am. The one other person who might think it's worth trying. This last-ditch defense against the aliens or the in-laws or those frightening late-night infomercial people. It's after midnight again, when everything that comes along is that much harder to resist, and where I've come to live more often than I'd like, just a single touch-tone button away, apparently, from the madhouse. I'm so wide awake now in the dark, it's not funny. And there's nothing left to say along the miles of open line, nothing to do but quietly lay down the receiver in its cradle and take the long walk back to sleep. And if I make it that far again tonight, you can be absolutely sure that's when the Venusian scout ships will be closing in, or Patricia's mother, and somewhere Mr. Car Wax Guru will be setting a Chevrolet on fire to the paid-off astonishment of his TV studio audience. One more brilliant lesson in the virtue of sheer resilience, and he'll swear nothing else on earth can stand up to that kind of heat. But three of us, more or less, in our foil-wrapped, American-as-baked potato wisdom, will know better. There's me, my wrong number friend, and Stewart, wherever he is right now. May his meds make him unbreakable, and doctors never talk him fully out of his half-baked, hard-won silence. May his friends wait until morning, though, before ringing through to him there. And let the plans of the space people and our relatives and anyone else who would come to us in our woozy sleep, on this night at least, come to naught. May they be foiled with any luck, and with our blessings or our curses foiled again. May it turn out they've been looking all along for someone else. And if they find us instead, certifiable, wrong numbers, may they have to tell us exactly how sorry they are and for how much. Given the crush of increasingly unstable particles in the universe, it's no small thing how surprisingly undisturbed we actually are, how quiet it so often is on our end of the line. And whenever we get to thinking, that's okay, there's quite enough still ringing in our ears for one more night or for a lifetime. Then here comes another one of those voices out of nowhere saying, in so many words, we haven't heard anything yet.
In the St. Louis Magazine article, a couple of people were quoted as saying you lived the life of a hermit to some degree, and I assume that that's somewhat attached to writers, because writing is somewhat a lonely act at times. But yet, before your laureateship, you also reached out to different groups and spread the word of poetry. Can you talk a little about that
I think
experience?
on the hermit thing, though a lot of people will smile and call me such, it really is realizing that there are so many hours in a day. And so here is what I do with my public face on, which in general terms will be the classroom stuff. I've got my family, you know, the two people that I care most about in the world. So you start cutting up that pie, it gets a little bit dicey. So hermit in the sense of, maybe another way to put it, I'd rather write than be a writer. It's easy to be a writer. You just declare, I'm a poet. And there you are. You okay. But, and thus, a lot of time with people that are more interested in that and whatever that is supposed to garner them attention-wise, eats up a lot of hours at the day hanging out at the Poets Cocktail Lounge or the this and that Bemidji Writers Conference, flitting and fritting around. So hermit in the sense of, yeah, I'd rather not have that be a part of it. That's the poetry biz. That's the poetry business. But yeah, I really think it's harder to make a poem, and I mean that seriously, but with a smile. It's harder to make a poem than say, I'm a poet. Now, the laureate is a different deal, because what's happened there is, because there is this title, and this is the good side of it, it gives a lot of people a chance to find some access to a public side of poetry, not necessarily just mine, although in that aspect right now it happens to be me. And I think that's a good thing. Even if none of us are quite sure what a poet laureate is, and that includes me, and it's always a work in progress, I get contacted by a number of different people who have that as sort of a thing on the radar that they have somehow found out about. And then I do have the chance to follow up and talk with people who are not just in those classrooms, and are certainly not English majors or college students. So that's been a lot of fun, and I've done a good share of that before the laureate. The laureateship has just widened that net a little bit. So my interest in working with prisoners, though I've done that before, it's to renew and a chance to do that again. Rural libraries, whatever the situation is, where again, part of my job, I guess if you call it a job, is to make that art accessible, or try to show, without trying to convert people to the religion of poetry, that it has to do with their lives, that it has to do with real human lives.
You said you've done some work with in prisons and in correctional institutions, bringing poetry to people that are confined. Right. What does that mean to them?
When I was 21 years old and way in over my head, I was at the Rahway State Prison in New Jersey. where they famously filmed a documentary that has been copped over the years called Scared Straight. Well-known documentary where they bring in teenagers in trouble or with whatever youthful offenses, and some of these cons at Raw up in their face and trying literally to scare them straight. That's the title. Well, the guy who's the meanest and the fiercest in that particular documentary was one of my favorite people at the Rahway State Prison as a writer, and he also gave me a line, not a line of poetry, but a sentence, if you will, that sticks with me. Because he said, if you're telling us that the coin of the realm, his words, coin of the realm, for a writer is time, and it is, you have to have the time to do the work. He said, man, we've got nothing but time in here. And then the follow-up was, can you show us some more things to do with it in that aspect? So, though that gave me kind of a chill in a good sense at the time, and I'm not trying to say, oh, well, that's overly poignant, but yeah, in visits that I've made even in this last year to some of the correctional facilities here, without talking about it that way, the most interested and interesting people of the inmates say not just it's another thing like making a pot holder or doing something in craft, but wow, to really explore, you know, the heart and the mind that way. Because of course, so many of these people are very smart. It's not about being educated or not. And some of them are pretty smart in the ways of the heart too. So in a lot of different contexts, that's what's important to me. Just to show them it's an aspect of thinking about things. Not necessarily for you to exorcise your demons. I mean, I've got plenty of 18-year-olds in an intro writing class exorcising their demons, but just to try to take a look at the world and say, what's my relationship to it? What am I seeing at here? But that notion of time really stuck with me, lo, these many years later.
In my dream, Coleman Hawkins walked right up to me at the corner of West 52nd and Broadway, and he actually said, do you know how to get to Carnegie Hall? And even in my dream, I realized he'd been dead since 1969, although I still couldn't believe it. His not knowing Carnegie Hall was only blocks away. So I figured he'd meant all along to be setting me up instead. But who was I to deliver a punchline to the hawk himself, the royal bean, to my ear, the unmistakable heavyweight champion of the tenor saxophone world? I'll blow you a real quick chorus or two if you help me out just this one time, man. And that's exactly what the late Coleman Hawkins did. So finally, I had to tell him, practice. And I guess he had to laugh. That's really what I needed to hear. Then he thwacked me with his immortal horn, and I woke up to the coolest breeze through any window ever, my head still ringing with every strain of that man's body and soul. Over the many years, if I had $1, say, or adjust that for inflation, every time somebody would ask me, did that really happen to you? Did that late night phone call thing? Lots of narrative poems that are too long to read today, too. And my stock answer used to always be, does it seem as if it could have happened? Because I'm after the truth, but the emotional truth, not just the actual factual facts. And a nice distinction made earlier on by our journalist poet as well. So to muddy the waters completely, and for all those people who do or don't believe me whenever I would tell them, sometimes I isn't always me, this poem is called Albert Einstein Held Me in His Arms. Oh, you laugh. Albert Einstein held me in his arms, although my parents didn't know it at the time. And if I knew anything, even on some vaguely molecular level, I surely wasn't talking. No one was the wiser, except for Einstein, of course, taken with my small charms. He was crazy about how I couldn't stop smiling, drooling in my carriage on a Sunday afternoon in Princeton, the town my mother loved just driving to and getting out and losing herself in, absolutely smitten. And my pedestrian father was crazy about my mother. So even if that meant another goddamn trip to Highfalutinsville, New Jersey, he'd be there without fail, forever along for the ride. The way I finally heard it, Einstein was on his knees in a sweatshirt, rumpled chinos, and sneakers, pulling weeds. Merely being himself, my father would later say, utterly impressed. Einstein had that down to a science at 112 Mercer, the unassuming white frame house where he cultivated flowers, where he played the violin, precisely in sync with his favorite recordings late into the night, where he famously met with Bertrand Russell, Kurt Gödel, and Wolfgang Pauli for philosophic forays into the schnapps, then the higher mathematics. But on that one historic Sunday in the spring of my first year, Einstein himself welcomed the unrenowned likes of my mother and father. This 20th century giant picked me up with some easy peekaboo small talk in the last of the afternoon's fading light, until eventually, genius or no genius, I couldn't take it anymore. And I made a tiny grab for his wildly theoretical hair. And that was pretty much the end of our ad hoc civilization that flourished for 10 Princeton minutes. When Einstein died, only 6 weeks later, every newspaper ran his picture, and all at once my father couldn't believe it. Wasn't that the gardener who couldn't get enough of the baby? It says right here, he's Einstein, the guy who revolutionized our thinking about time and space. And what was that supposed to mean to my father exactly? My father wasn't Einstein, but he'd thought a lot about time and space too, deciding in his lifetime he wasn't about to get enough of either one. For years, my parents never said a word about that day, as if to remember it out loud would have been somehow unseemly, a kind of bragging they never much went in for, rather than a celebration of wonderful dumb luck Sunday driving, like every happy accident in the history of science, or in those classic, unlikely stories we can't help going back to for their mythic staying power. So let me put it this way to you. Albert Einstein held me in his arms before he died. Sooner or later, we're all trying to explain our particle selves in light of our own outlandish theories of relativity. Someone in my family, my mother or my father, maybe me, had to embellish at least some of the truth that comes finally right here at the end. My mother's horrified. I've yanked poor Einstein's hair, and she resigns herself, sighing, "It's time to go." To prove there are no hard feelings, he says something Einsteinian like, "Yes, but what is time?" Which my father misunderstands as a question he can actually answer. At that very minute at least, so he says, 5 o'clock. And before I know it, because I'm far too young to realize much of anything, remember, everyone's in a sudden hurry back into their uncertain futures, as if this whole thing never quite honestly happened. And in no time, it's 50 years later, and I'm the one still alive, all that's left of that story, telling myself, yes, it did. No, it didn't. No, it didn't.
With modern technology and internet, is it affecting poetry positively, negatively? How is it impacting the art form?
The impact is immediate. There are more online journals, if you will, publishing poetry, online magazines, online actual things that stand in where print used to, because it's more cost effective, you can reach, it stays out there forever. I think that beyond some of those logistics, that's where I think the jury is still at. I don't know. I think that it makes for a community, for people who want to find a community that can be far-flung, and you and I can talk about poetry or show each other or point each other to some stuffs, and you can be here and I can be on the other side of the state or the other side of the world. I think those are all good things. So that the internet itself, I mean, it's just an explosion of places that will publish this stuff, poems. I'm not sure that's always a grand idea, but I've got nothing against that. I think if anything, where I get my dinosaur hackles up a little bit, is more working at the computer as a poet. And my standard answer there that I still believe, it's too easy to change things. I want things to be thought about. I want things to be violently crossed out, but you can still see them. So basically, I mean, with the internet itself and the access to a wider world of poetry, I think that's pretty remarkable.
Is poetry for the page or for the stage?
Ideally, I'd love it to be both, and so we can go back to its origins before Gutenberg and before too many monks got into that habit, even pre-Gutenberg, of transcribing that it's an oral art to begin with, and of course it is, but in the evolution of it, I love something as a reader that I can respond to and get excited about on the page. And if I hear it from the stage, I like to think of that as gravy. There are students that I'll see who've never read at a book of poems, but they can tell you they've been to 29 readings in the last 2.5 days. If I had a gun to my head, I'd rather that person spend 10 minutes with one poem than spend an hour listening to 10 poems. So I think that, there's a lot to be said to hear, obviously. It really brings it alive. But I think a good reader can do that too. Now, if after a reading of mine somebody will say, oh, I wish I could hear it when I read poems the way you make it sound. And they mean it complimentary. I suppose you're a good reader, a good interpreter of this stuff. But what I'm suggesting is your pitch and tone might be different than mine, but I'm giving you places to stop and start, any poet is. I'm giving you a score, and that's how I think of it as a poem, much like a musician's score, where to stop and start. I want my ideal reader to be able to do that, and it's not going to sound exactly as if I were reading it out loud, but it will be pretty darn close. So page or stage, let's say stage.
The tofu that's shown up overnight in this house is frightening. Proof of the law of conservation. Matter that simply cannot be created or destroyed. Matter older than Newton, who knew better than to taste it. Older than Lao Tzu, who thought about it but finally chose harmonious non-interference. I'd like to be philosophical too. See it as some kind of pale, inscrutable wisdom among my hot dogs, the cold chicken, the leftover deviled eggs, but I'm talking curdled soybean milk, and I don't have that kind of energy. I'd rather not be part of the precariously metaphorical wedding of modern physics and those ancient Eastern mysteries, but still, whoever stashed the tofu in my Frigidaire had better come back for it soon. I'm not Einstein, but I'm smart enough to know a bad idea when I see it, taking up space, biding its time. Like so much that demands our imperfect attention amid the particle roar of this world, it's going nowhere fast.
So this poem is called The Flamingos Have Left the Building. And it starts with an epigraph from a 1957 Sears Roebuck catalog listing for the original flamingo lawn ornament made by Union Products in Leominster, Massachusetts. Place them in garden or on lawn to beautify landscape. $2.76 the pair. For Becky Shaw, Flamingo Conservator. Just shy of 50 years since it arrived, the classic pink flamingo's gone extinct, done in by the rising cost of plastic, an unrelenting flood of Chinese knockoffs. A 22-year-old Don Featherstone designed the birds for hometown Union Products. They flew off store shelves, landing everywhere, and Leominster, Mass. was in the pink. They ruled the roost of lawn art kitsch before the gnomes and bug-eyed frogs moved in to stay. A nod to all those bronze and marble statues on more expansive properties than theirs. One was never quite enough. You paired them up, or better yet, a flock, a sudden conflagration of bright pink flamingos in the hottest yards around, and next-door neighbors surely had to think, there goes the neighborhood, or else we've got to get us some of those before too long. But now it's too late. Going going, gone. In pink flamingo transmigration, they left their yards for other habitats, festooning tablecloths and dinner plates, or showing up in paint-by-number kits as earrings, window shades, and whirligigs, and in disguise, sunglasses, bedroom slippers, umbrellas, walking sticks, and floppy hats, then stirring cocktails, shaking salt and pepper, or trapped inside those snow globes a long way from the natural Florida sun. When a good flamingo idea goes bad, they're accessories after the plastic fact. My friend insists her purple house is where she caught a poacher in her yard, pink-handed, in floodlights she installed after she learned new birds of Featherstone would flock no more. Like any cause that's lost, they were absorbed into the culture they did not bring down. No leg to stand on now, defenseless, but still undeniably there on Becky's lawn.